Swerve today.
What's good, everybody? What's good? It's your boy, Cardinal Bud Crawford, or E.S. Red, if that's what you want to call me. And we are back for another one. Alright, y'all. New topic. Who first? Will Terence Bud Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. retire after November Undisputed fight? Alright, y'all. So, both of these guys, some people would say that they're at the highest point of their career, or they're in the prime of their careers. Some people will say they're on the last leg of their careers. Both of these guys are in their 30s. You only get older, you don't get younger. There are new lion fighters out here, new fighters that people believe that their skill sets are better than Errol Spence and Terence Crawford. We know who those fighters are. But, the question now that we know that the fight is going to happen, both of these guys are going to get it on. Somebody's O has got to go. After the O is gone, what happens to these two fighters? One of these fighters is not going to be popular anymore after November. One of these fighters are not going to be at the height of their career anymore after November. What does Terence Crawford's career look like if he loses his O and has no title belt? What does Terence Crawford's career look like at that point? Is he able to rebuild, move on? We all know that there's more than likely going to be a rematch clause involved in this fight. So somebody might potentially have two losses after November, after 2022 is over, 2023, into 2023, somebody might have two losses. One of these fighters could potentially have two losses. You take the original fight and you take the rematch, somebody could be sitting on two losses, and somebody could have no belts at that point. Are they the same fighters? Is Terence Crawford the same fighter without a title belt and with two losses? Is Errol Spence the same fighter without 3 title belts and 2 losses? I feel like this. I think that Terence Crawford, because of his age, because of his lack of challenging himself, because of the fact he doesn't have a promoter, and it's kind of crazy at this point in his career that he would try independence. Although the whole promotional thing, it's being with a promoter, it's kind of getting old. It's kind of getting played out. And as a welterweight, I don't even think, because welterweight boxing is so kind of messed up at this point. PBC had all the best welterweights, but now all of those welterweights have been ran through. Everybody's they've had their best fights, and some of them they lost. Some of them won. Some people won, some people lost. Like the Keith Thurman, he lost to Pacquiao, kind of destroyed his boxing career. Even though he's still active, Shawn Porter just retired. He might as well have been retired. Danny Garcia, he's kind of a nobody at this point. We got the new guys coming up. But, as far as the old fighters, Adrian Broner, I'm not sure what's going on with his career, if he's even going to try to make a comeback. And then, who's left after that? You don't really have any more big names at welterweight, even though PBC was the king of welterweights at one point. It seems like now super welterweight is about to be the division to be in, because all the leftover welterweights of yesteryear, they've either been beaten or they've retired. The last two greats are Errol Spence and Terence Crawford. I love to bring up Manny Pacquiao, but he's been quiet for the past couple of weeks, so I don't know what's going on with him at this point. There were rumblings of him perhaps taking on Terence Crawford if the Spence fight fell apart, but that talk has went silent. I guess the negotiations didn't break down far enough for Pacquiao to get involved. Who is left? You know, you have the new guys. You have the Boots. You got the Virgils. You got Sindonius. There are a few other guys who are out there. But a couple of those guys, they're not even on PBC Boxing. Boots is independent, but I believe he has a Showtime deal now. So, you know, where does, if Terence Crawford was to take a loss, where would he turn? Would he go back? Would he stay at 147? Would he go back down, or would he move up to super welterweight? Or would he eventually just retire after perhaps 2 wars with Errol Spence Jr. and 2 losses and 0 title belts? I don't think Terence Crawford at that point would be the same fighter anymore. I don't think his fan base, very loyal at the moment. I don't think they ride with him with 2 losses, 0 title belts, and trying to rebuild, perhaps fighting a Boots or a Virgil, or moving up to 154 and trying to take on a Charlo or perhaps somebody else at 154. He's not the same fighter without those title belts, without that title belt. I shouldn't say title belts because Errol Spence is the one holding belts. Terence Crawford has a belt. But his career is not the same without that accolade that he's holding. Same thing goes for Errol Spence Jr. If Errol Spence Jr. takes 2 losses to Terence Crawford and no longer has 3 title belts, is he the same fighter trying to move forward? Because we know one thing about Errol Spence Jr. Ain't no going down in weight for him. He's not going back to 140. Now, Terence Crawford could potentially go back to 140 after losing twice to Errol Spence and losing a title belt. He can still go down to 140, get a Josh Taylor fight, instant fame again. He could be undisputed just like that, you know, once again at 140. So there is an option for him, even if he lost, because I don't think if he lost to Errol Spence Jr., he would want any parts of Boots or Virgil. Same thing goes for Errol Spence. Once again, even though he can't move down in weight, he can move up in weight, and there's a potential Charlo fight that's waiting for him there. Is Charlo willing to stick around 154? He's undisputed at this point, but is he willing to stick around 154 for another year when he can move up to 160 and make even bigger money? You know, there's always Triple G. Well, we don't know what's going to happen with the Triple G Canelo fight. One of those guys could potentially retire after this. You know, I think more people would consider Triple G closer to retirement than Canelo, but it all depends on how this fight turns out. If Triple G convincingly beats Canelo and Canelo just came off a loss, is Canelo going to still be as popular as he is right now? You know, that question, it goes for a lot of fighters at this moment. So what does Errol Spence look like without 3 title belts and having 2 losses? I think at that point, because of the type of guy Errol Spence is, I don't think it affects him. I think it affects him, but not as much as it would affect Terence Crawford, because there's already so much negative stigma placed on Terence Crawford because of his resume, because of Bob Arum, because it's taken so long to make the Spence fight. I think Terence Crawford is the one who gets more of the blame for all of this than Errol Spence does. So I think even if Errol Spence lost, Errol Spence's fan base is so loyal to him, and Errol Spence, I don't know what his contract is with PBC, how long it carries over, but I do feel like Errol Spence could immediately go take on a Charlo and still have instant fame, and still potentially could beat the Charlo. You know, it depends on how bad he would lose to Terence Crawford, and that would dictate what would happen in the future. Like, okay, let's say one of these guys gets knocked out twice. Say Terence Crawford gets knocked out twice by Errol Spence. What then? Is Terence Crawford still a household name at that point? I think even if he got knocked out twice by Errol Spence Jr., I think Terence Crawford would still be a household name. I think even if he got knocked out twice by Errol Spence Jr., I think Terence Crawford would still be a household name. I think even if he got knocked out twice by Errol Spence Jr., I think Terence Crawford would still be a household name. I think even if he got knocked out twice by Errol Spence Jr., I think Terence Crawford would still be a household name. I think even if he got knocked out twice by Errol Spence Jr., I think Terence Crawford would still be a household name. I think even if he got knocked out twice by Errol Spence Jr., I think Terence Crawford would still be a household name. I think even if he got knocked out twice by Errol Spence Jr., I think Terence Crawford would still be a household name. I think even if he got knocked out twice by Errol Spence Jr., I think Terence Crawford would sti a move down to 140 in a Josh Taylor fight would still make sense. I think a move up to 154 and trying to take on a Charlo would potentially get his head knocked off. But if he moved back down to 140 where the punching power isn't as devastating, he could still make a splash at 140 and potentially be undisputed again, a reigning champion, a seated champion at 140. For Errol Spence, I think it's a lot more difficult because he can't go down in weight, because he can't go into a division or down in weight to face lighter punchers, to put it for lack of a better word, to go down and weight and face some lighter handed punchers. He would have to move up in weight, I think, because I think boots is a problem for either one of those guys. Virgil would be a problem for either one of those guys. And if you've gotten knocked out by Terence Crawford, who's not known for punching power, I think it would be dangerous to face up with a Virgil who's known for punching power, or even a Boots who's known for some of the quickest hands and the switching style with power. Now, maybe not Virgil power, but with power and extremely, extremely good skills. I think a move up in weight, it would benefit Errol Spence, even though he would be dealing with some even harder punchers at that point. But the Charlo fight's there. You could potentially be undisputed if you was to beat him, and it would keep your name within the public, out there in front of boxing fans, even after your potential loss to Terence Crawford and losing all those belts. Who would it affect more? I definitely think it would affect Terence Crawford more than it would Errol Spence. And the fact that Errol Spence has a promoter, has PBC, who has built in, they got all these fighters and fights that could be made very simply for Errol Spence Jr., where it's, I think, only going to get more difficult for Terence Crawford. Even if he wins, I think if he wins, it changes everything, because he could potentially go get with a promoter at that point, and he would be the hottest thing in boxing at that point. So it wouldn't be hard for him to secure some type of promotion. But I think for Errol Spence, if he lost, it's going to make it extremely difficult. For Errol Spence, it's different, PBC is what it is. So let me know what y'all think about that down in the comment section. Hit that like button for me. Share. Subscribe. Tell a friend. Holler at me on all social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. You're more than likely to get a response on the tube. So holler at me over there if you want a response. It's your boy, Cardinal Bud Crawford, or E.S. Red, if that's what you want to call me. And I think we are out of here.
If all of us get caught, nigga, none of us sleep. Shut up.